me make a plug that maybe is preaching to the choir. I don't know, but regional elimination, I think, are these regional or area control projects. Probably the best game we got going now. I think the only other game we have is to keep doing what we're doing, but I think the regional control is something that the stakes are so high, and it's of the nature where cooperation of this type on a regional basis, even despite Peter's well-founded concerns about pigs moving in and out and so forth, I think we have to go down this route. Otherwise, we're going to be just doing what we've always been doing, which hasn't necessarily always worked that well. And I also agree with Peter that the social problems that we'll face doing that are obviously the biggest. And Bobby, I don't think it's hard to overestimate the work you did in Stevens County there to get that done, to get and overcome that. So I think it's a good model, and others are trying it now as well. And so I guess I felt compelled to make that plug, and maybe it was unnecessary, but what I'm going to try to accomplish today are these three things. I'm going to try to give some background on what PADRAP is for those that are less familiar with it. I'll just spend a little bit of time doing that. The second thing I'm going to do is give some examples of how it's being used today. So not necessarily within the framework of a regional or area control project, but just how veterinarians are using it today and how we're using it in research. And then finally, I'm going to give some examples both of how it is being used today in regional or area control projects and how I think it might be used in the future. So here's a screenshot of the home page, if you will, of PADRAP. It's an entirely web-based program. If you want to go out to padrap.org and check it out, there's some information out there. I have to admit that hasn't been updated in a while, and so we probably need to do that. But there's also a link here then to the login, and if you've gone through one of the training programs in the past and are an AASV member, then you can actually go ahead and log in, and most of you, hopefully, if you've gone through that training, have done that, and then that's how you access it. And so it's all username and password control. Enter your username here, your password, say you accept the terms, and then you click submit, and you're in. Once you're in, you can set up production systems, set up various breeding herd sites under each of those production systems if there's more than one site. And then once you complete that task, you can set up surveys for those breeding herd sites and complete them online. And so here's an example of what the survey looks like online. And the alternative to doing that online is to print that survey out as a PDF file, take that to the farm, complete it, and then have a secretary back at the office or somebody else enter it in. Or if you've got extra time on your hands, then you get to do that. And then here's an example of one of the benchmarking reports. And there's a number of those. Almost all of the reports that we produce are benchmarking type reports. So we're comparing the risk for whatever site you did the assessment for to other sites that are in the database. And so it's all kind of a Iowa basic skills or standardized test type approach where oftentimes you get your score back and it's related to everybody else that took that test. So you know if you're smarter than 95% of them or 95% are smarter than you, so you find it out. So. All right, real brief history of development. Began back in fall of 2002. Dale and others at Boehringer were working on this idea. Back then, those of you who've had an opportunity to hear Dale talk about this, he likes to show a slide of version 0, which is a whiteboard with a bunch of lines on it. And so that was basically when that all started. I got involved in about early 2004, January 2004, and we were working on the second version of the program at that time. And that's what's been out since then. And so we've been using version 2 of the breeding herd risk assessment since then. In March of 2005, then Boehringer offered to gift it to AASV. And because AASV had never really done anything like this in the past, it took about a year for the board to decide to take it on. And so it wasn't just a year doing nothing. There was a lot of due diligence, and Tom was diligently working to get resources lined up and so forth. Then a year later, the board agreed to accept it. And then I joined Iowa State in July of that year, 2006, and then in September entered into an agreement with AASV provide the program coordination and manage it. And then sometime about that same time, the name PADRAP came into being, and it's stuck ever since. And that stands for Production Animal Disease Risk Assessment Program. And we purposely kept it general. You'll notice that swine is not in the name, nor is PRRS. And so our intention is to expand the program to different diseases, different stages of production, even different species. So, and then November last year, then we launched PADRAP Online. So prior to that, everything was, the risk assessment was in a spreadsheet, Excel spreadsheet, and now everything is online. And so that's a huge leap forward for us. Access to the risk assessment tool is still restricted to AASV member veterinarians only who go through a training session. And we do that for a number of reasons that I won't go into here, but certainly the validity of the data is the number one reason. So since we're benchmarking, it's very important that we have relatively valid data in the database. We've put on, I counted these the other day, and I forgot how many there were. I think it was about 30 sessions, over 20, somewhere between 25 and 30 sessions we put on. Some of these were at a couple sessions since June of 2005. And we've trained 195 veterinarians then on the program since then. And you'll notice some of these were done in, recently we've done a number of these in Canada and Mexico. We did some in Ontario about a year and a half ago. We've done some recently in Western Canada, Quebec, and then a couple in Mexico as well. So expanded it into North America. So we're trying to go beyond what we were before. The next, I should mention while I was on there, and you don't want to go backwards, but the next training session that we have planned it will be at AASV in Dallas, so next March. And we typically are doing these in the U.S. now on a kind of an as-demanded basis. And whereas before we were probably having 3, 4, 5 of these a year, now in the U.S. anyway, we're not doing near that many now, but we are doing more in Mexico and Canada. So consequently, as demanded means if you tell us you want more, we'll put more on. In the database. So as veterinarians have completed these risk assessments, they automatically get submitted into the database. And currently there's 1,400, over almost 1,500 assessments that are in the database. Those represent about 900 unique breeding herd sites. Some of these sites have been assessed multiple times, usually on about an annual basis. And so that's why this number is bigger than that number. Okay, just an overview then. This is kind of what the risk assessment looks like. Have a questionnaire there that's broken down in 3 parts. The first part collects demographic and historical information about the site. Then there's one on internal risk factors, and then another on external risk factors. So these internal risk factor questions relate to circulation of resident viruses, whereas these external risk factor questions relate to introduction of a non-resident or a new virus. Like I mentioned, there's a database here in the middle, sits in the middle of this, and then from there we can do research with that data or try to learn from it and generate these reports that are immediately available once you submit an assessment. Okay? And like I mentioned before, most of these are benchmarking type reports. So what's in just a snapshot of what's in the database today. Of those 900 and whatever site, 904 sites, 670 of them are in the U.S., 180 are in Canada, and then 54 in Mexico. And that number has actually changed a fair bit now. Mexico's really cranked out a bunch of them here recently, and I think even Canada has as well. But in the U.S. anyway, though, those 670 sites, we summed up the breeding herd inventory in those, and it represents about 25% of the U.S. breeding herd. So we're getting to feel pretty good about the volume or the density of the data now to do some things like risk factor surveillance and that type of thing. So. Okay, so examples of how it's being used. First one and most common is as a tool to evaluate current biosecurity procedures. And Erin Johnson is going to present some information at AASV on Monday, I think, on things she's learned by using the risk assessment, kind of some case examples of how she's put the information together and used it for her clients. But that's probably the most common way it's been used in the past. This thing seems to be random when it works. There we go. The way it's been used in the past, and so that's far and away is most common. But the second is to demonstrate improvement in biosecurity over time to help justify expenditures for resources. And Dr. Waddell, John Waddell, has did a really good, nice example of this for one of the production systems he works with. And actually, I'll present that here in a couple slides. The third one on that slide is as an aid in the decision to initiate a project to eliminate PRRS. And that's a number of, it's been used a number of times for this purpose, and I think a very good use of it. And I'd like to be able to say that most of the time the veterinarian is doing this to objectively obtain information to help him decide whether or not to go ahead and do it. Basically trying to decide whether they can keep it negative long enough to justify the cost of doing it. But most of the time, and Paul can back me up on this, it's the veterinarian has a preconceived notion ahead of time what he wants to do, and he uses this to browbeat the client to do it, right? I shouldn't say it that way, but it's additional piece of information that helps the veterinarian and the producer decide whether or not it is a wise thing to do. So, as an aid in the decision to use as a breeding herd site, so basically taking a commercial site, converting it into multiplication or maybe a dire nucleus. And so it's been used that way a number of times. And the last one is part of a due diligence process for agreements or purchases. And I'm not necessarily comfortable even with that use, but I'm aware of one case where it was done that way, and so I put that on there. So here's John's work that he did with one of his production systems. Basically had 15 breeding herd sites in the system. And at that time, there were about 874 assessments in the database. Actually, I think Jamie put these together. I think she actually put these all correspond, I think, to, I think it was 2005. No, that's not right. I don't remember where these are, but these there's a constant background here. It doesn't change every year. But plotted these sites, those 15 sites in this production system against the database and 05. And then they made a number of changes immediately following that. So they made some investments. Some of them required some pretty hefty capital investments. They put in some truck drying bays, changed how they how people were introduced in farms, or how the entry, I should say, into farms, and some basic biosecurity things like that. Redid the assessments in 06, and you can nicely see. And okay, this is only going to work if this works. There we go, 2005, 2006. So you can see a nice shift downward, and came back a year later in 07, and then did them finally in 08. There we go. So 07, 08. So you can see over time, nice shift in mainly in the external risk going down. And I probably should have, apologize, I should have explained this chart before I did that. On the vertical axis, here you have the external risk index score. And so you just take all of those questions that relate to external risk, sum them up, and take an average. And then you do the same thing for the internal risk score, which is on the horizontal axis here. And you just plot those on this chart. And so the red dots represent the 15 sites, one for each site. And the blue background is all the other sites in the database. The gray lines represent the median for median internal, median external risk scores. And so if you end up in this quadrant up here, you're high. You're above the median for both internal and external. Down here is low, both internal and external. Okay? And so now I can, if quicker or cooperate, I can go through those again. And you can kind of see basically what's happening is the external risk score is shifting down over time. So here's 05, 06, 07, 08. Okay? So just a way to kind of quantify and track biosecurity changes over time. And Dale put this together, and so I stole it from him, but Dale, I'll give you credit for it. So, but he took 12 of those 15 sites because we had data for those 12 here, and plotted the red bar. The number down here represents the external risk score for those 12 sites each year, and the line represents the number of breaks they reported in the last 2 years, previous 2 years. So it's kind of a rolling average number of breaks in the previous 2 years, and so you can see a nice correlation there. So. Okay, so moving on to another use of it is we've used it in a number of different research projects, the risk assessment. And I'll just go through one example of those here. This was a pilot study, actually, of one that's ongoing currently. Basically, we were going to try to answer the question, why do negative breeding herd farms go positive? Okay? Or more specifically, why do some go positive very quickly while others stay negative for a longer period of time? So it's basically a survival analysis, right? We're looking at trying to see why some farms survive after they're negative, meaning they stay negative, or some die, meaning they go positive. And this was a study that Paul had initiated. I guess, when was that initiated? It was in 04? 04. And so then I got involved in it, at least at a later point in time. But the objective of the study, then, I already mentioned there. I think we were going to use, well, I didn't mention that, but we used the version 1. Recall we're using version 2 now. But at that time, version 1 was used because version 2 hadn't been developed yet. Version 1 of the risk assessment was used, and we were trying to see if there was any relationship. The hypothesis was, is there some relationship between the external risk score as measured by the risk assessment and how long they survive, how long they stay negative. Okay? And so Paul had 39 sites that had been established as naive, either by startup populated with naive animals, or depop, repop, and repopulated with naive animals. So there were no herd closure and rollover herds in this. It was all depop, repops, and new startups. Mentioned already, risk assessment version 1 was used. Risk assessments were done at the starter project, and then for those that broke, assessments were done, I believe, at the time they broke as well. And all the assessments were done by Paul. So, and then we compared those to other sites in the database, and at that time there was about 312 sites in the version 1 risk assessment database. And you can see most of the sites, which are the red sites, the 39 are the red dots, triangles, diamonds, I guess, tended to cluster down here already. They were relatively low external and even maybe a relatively low internal risk. So relative to the other sites in the database, these were relatively low. By the way, these were all located in southern Minnesota, northern Iowa was the location of these. Okay, so after some period of time, and that's the nature of survival studies, is you have to start them and then wait. You have to wait for quite a long time, actually. But where we are today, then here, this is a Kaplan-Meier survival curve. On the vertical axis here, you got the percent that are surviving at each point in time on the horizontal axis. This is in weeks. So from those of you at the back of the room maybe can't read that, it starts out at 0, and we're clear out here to almost 20 years, 1,196 weeks. Okay? And so as farms go positive, and this dotted line in the middle is all 39, and so as they go positive, the percent surviving goes down over time, and so you get this survival curve that results. What we did here was looked at, to test our hypothesis, we said, okay, well, let's subgroup, or let's categorize all of those 39 sites according to whether they were above or below the median external risk score as measured by the risk assessment. And so we plotted those that were below the median, so relatively low risk here, and those that were above the median, relatively high risk, on the red line here. And so you can see there's a big difference, significantly different survival curves for those two groups. So say that, yes, it did matter, whether they were relatively high risk or low risk as measured by the risk assessment. Also looked at when they were established as naive herds. So basically when they were either repopulated or started up or initially populated if it was a startup. And because winter is the high-risk group, we looked at winter versus all other seasons. So the subgroup that was established in the winter is represented by this red line, this here, and then all others are on the blue line here. And so you can see there is a visual difference, but not a significant one, at least as on the Kaplan-Meier survival curve. Now, the final thing we did is said, okay, Paul had done some work with some budgeting in the past and had come up with a benchmark rule, or rule of thumb, let's call it, that they had to keep these sites negative for a period of at least 12 months. And keep in mind, this is for a complete depop repop. For at least 12 months to get a payback. Am I misquoting that? Okay. And so we looked at whether or not this is a binary categorical variable. Did it survive 12 months or not? Okay, so it's either one or zero, true or false. And then we did a logistical regression to see if the external risk score and the month it was established, whether it was established winter or not, were significant. And of course, when you do a logistical regression, you get these nice little odds ratios, which is why they're done. And sure enough, the odds ratio for those sites that had high external risk score, relatively high external risk score, was 14 times. So they had a 14 times, the odds were 14 times higher for those that had a high to those that had a low measured risk score. And then we also looked at winter month, and sure enough there too, the odds ratio, the odds of sites that were established in the winter was 5.7 times higher that it would not survive 12 months compared to those that were established in the spring, summer, and fall. Okay? And those odds ratios were statistically significant for both of those because neither of them has one in the confidence interval here. Okay, so both were greater than one and both significant. All right, so we were excited enough by that we wanted to do an expanded study, very much along the same lines, and so this was a study that was initially funded by PRRS Cap 1. It's ongoing. Started in May 1 of 2006, 5-year study. We're in the 3rd year. We just finished the 3rd year of it. We hire veterinary interns every summer to go out and capture the data every summer. Some of you I know are involved in that, and so have an idea of what we're doing there. We've got approximately 220 sites. We're probably going to end up with 200 of those. There's about 20 of them that are probably not, that don't necessarily meet our criteria. We'll throw those out like we did. We've got about 200 breeding herd sites that at the time we enrolled them were negative or naive breeding herd sites. And one other difference, other than the number of herds we got in the study, another difference from the pilot study is that in this one we've also enrolled herd closure and rollovers. Okay, so we'll be able to look at any differences there might be between complete depop repumps, startups, and herd closure and rollovers. Okay, just a real quick glimpse of what's in there today. We got a pretty good representation of all the states. It's all U.S. breeding herd sites, though, and not exactly representative of where the sows are, but as you probably would expect, you got some states that are relatively lightly populated with pigs that show up relatively heavily here. That's just the nature of this type of site we were looking for. And then herd size, relatively good mix. So we got some small herds all the way up to some very big herds and everything in between. And type of production, you can see it's generally relatively heavily weighted towards the genetic side. Again, what you probably would expect given that we had to enroll negative or naive sites. Okay, so that's what's in there today. We're getting very close to being able to produce at least some preliminary results from that. Last fall and winter really helped us out. That we had before that we didn't have many that had broke. So unfortunately, I shouldn't say that publicly. All right, and then finally, and Bob, how am I doing for time? 5 minutes. Okay, perfect. Finally, then, how it might be utilized in area regional PRRS control projects. Then, start with how it currently is being used. And Enrique already mentioned this project, and so maybe as a reference, you recognize the map there that he put up. But we did the training session for Enrique and a group of veterinarians in Sonora about a month and a half ago, and so Enrique already explained pretty well how they're doing it. Now, the other thing they're doing, which we greatly appreciate, is they're going to get it translated into Spanish before that gets used, and so that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be available online, but at least the questionnaire is going to be available to them in Spanish. So. And then the other one that we did this training session about 3 weeks ago in Quebec is a program, and George, do you know how to pronounce that You live next to Quebec.
Beauce.
So. How's it?
Beauce.
Beauce. Okay, so in the Beauce area near Quebec, and this is supported by a number of groups, including producers, but also some federal and region or provincial bodies, including the Council for Development of Pork in Quebec, and this is kind of the main group that's coordinating that one. So, and like what Enrique's doing in Sonora, I think they're going to use PADRAP to assess all the sites that they get involved in that control project early on in the study, or in the project, I should say. So, then what role might risk assessment play then in a regional PRRS control project? Well, first of all, to evaluate the feasibility of the project, and I think that's a stated objective in Enrique's project in Sonora there. But I think in any case it can be used to evaluate the feasibility of the project, which is maybe a little bit ahead of itself. But the first step is going to be to determine the short-term objectives and the goals of the project. So depending on what the goals and objectives are, will dictate what the feasibility is, I suppose. But the risk assessment can also be used then to help determine what the objectives and goals are for the program. So it may help be a little bit more realistic about what can be done and over what period of time. Okay, and then evaluate the likelihood of the project success. So once you know what the goals and objectives are, then what's the likelihood that you'll be successful with it? Again, just a piece of information, not the entire piece that you need to know, but probably the bigger question will be who you got involved in that project and how likely are they to be engaged. But again, a piece of information that can help decide whether it will be successful. And then estimated timeline of the project. So again, hopefully be realistic about how long these things will take, and risk assessment maybe can help assess how long it might take. And identify activities that will increase the likelihood of success. So maybe the way things are today isn't so good, but maybe there's some things that can be changed that would maybe speed the project up or increase the likelihood of success. And I just put up an example here, probably pretty hard to read from the back, but got a particular site here that may be part of a regional control, but that's has off-site disposal of deads. They don't have an enclosure. They're stored in outside for pickup, and the last one has refrigerated pickups not available either. But got a number of things maybe to work on there in terms of biosecurity for individual sites that might improve the likelihood of success. And then to establish a baseline for measured risks, and so much like what Waddell did for one production system, there's no reason you can't do that kind of thing for an area or regional set of farms, and monitor changes in measured risk over time, and again, hopefully progress.